Thank you. We're going to make the long walk to these chairs. Wow, what a big crowd.
Hi, everyone.
Good. This is great. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate seeing all of you. And Sharon, do I have to call you Rabbi? Or can I just call you Sharon?
Sharon.
Sharon?
Yeah.
Rabbi Sharon? Sharon. I'll just call you Sharon.
You get to choose.
I'm just going to call you Sharon, whether you like it or not.
That's very respectful.
Thank you very much. I want to talk about everything in the time that we have. We're going to start with Genesis, and we're going to move right through to the Trump campaign. Is that okay?
There's a direct line there. Yes. Right.
Fill in the joke, right? I don't know what the joke is yet, but we'll come up with it. But this book is very interesting. I want to focus on the book and the things that you're interested in bringing out to the broader world, the lessons that you've learned as America's top rabbi. Is that like a show? That should be like...
I tell Jeffrey, my mom made that list.
Yeah, it's like, according to her mom, she's the top rabbi in America.
I'm the number one rabbi.
Number one rabbi. America's top rabbi.
That's right.
But the lessons are broad, and you have, and I've, known you a bit and known what you're preoccupied with, and a lot of what you write about is about the connection among human beings and the challenges that we face in our society today. So I want to, maybe you can do a little bit of framing here. Let me frame the framing for you before we do that. No, I'm going to preface myself with a preface.
That's so rabbinic.
We were just we finished yet? Are we going? To me, there's this quote from E.O. Wilson that I mentioned to you that I find explains most of the challenges that we're facing globally today as a species. And that is, he said that the main challenge facing humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, right? And that how we our institutions aren't capable of mediating the technology that we're inventing, and our own lizard brains can't handle the speed and complexity of the things that we invent, and so we end up a lot of problems, obviously, but the problem that you write about so eloquently is the problem of isolation and loneliness and polarization and alienation, and I always think that, this expression that politics is downstream from culture, but I tend to think that culture is downstream from psychiatry and theology and a whole bunch of other things. And so I wanted, maybe you could just frame out what you think of as the crisis you're addressing in our society.
Yeah, okay. First of all, so our emotions are Paleolithic, our institutions are medieval. And our technology is godlike.
Godlike, yeah.
Okay, I can't beat that, but I can try and share how I see that playing out.
You got 40 minutes to come up with a better expression.
Okay, so the book emerged out of a growing trend that I was calling a crisis already about 11 years ago when I first gave a sermon called The Amen Effect. The trend was this trend of loneliness to the point of really ill health. We were unwell. And I saw that in my pastoral capacity in the community. I saw that people felt this extreme isolation from one another, a kind of growing distrust in community and in society, well before the pandemic. And in fact, the evidence has shown now, some of the really great literature on loneliness started to emerge about a decade and a half ago, and where we started to learn that acute loneliness affects the body roughly the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Some of the things did you know that? It's incredible, the impact on our heart and lungs. The Surgeon General has been speaking about this now, and we have an incredible Surgeon General. We're so lucky that he's taking this so seriously. And so this literature, I came to it from a pastoral perspective, trying to understand what is this crisis? People are coming into my office and just breaking down. And I felt like our whole society is breaking down. So we have this spiritual problem, which is we feel like nobody sees me. And it's hard for me to really see another person, like as if there's some kind of obscurity or distance between one person and another. Then the literature tells us that there's, not only is it affecting our spirits, it's affecting our bodies. And then we can see in the political discourse that it's literally threatening our democracy. This sense of loneliness, disconnection, social alienation, all of which, by the way, lend themselves to extremism. Hannah Arendt was writing in the 20th century that loneliness and social alienation are a precondition for totalitarianism. That tyrannical regimes cannot take hold in a society in which people know their neighbors. And so we have this situation where pre-pandemic, we know that 1 in 3 Americans did not know the names of their next door neighbors. So I'm just curious how many people here actually know the names of your next door neighbors. With certainty, I mean, not like I think that guy. Okay. This is an amazing and unusual crowd, obviously. It's very self-selecting in this place. But many Americans do not. We also, there was another...
We're going to test all of you, by the way. We found all your neighbors' names, and you're not getting out of here.
Do you know your neighbors' names?
I know my neighbors. I know their social security numbers.
Okay,
too.
okay. Yeah. That's really creepy. Yeah. Okay, so... And there was another pre-pandemic survey that came out right when I sat down to write before I sat down to write the book, actually, that said that 20% of Americans say they don't have one single confidant in the world.
Yeah.
Not one person they trust in the world. And it's not just an American problem. I mean, there's like ministries of loneliness in Japan. There's a lot of work on this in Europe. So this is a problem that's happening all around the world. I think Jonathan Haidt would essentially argue that much of this comes from the rise of social media. Around 2012, that's when we saw a real tipping point in these numbers. I was coming at it from a spiritual
That's when it certainly, I mean, from his writing, that's when it started to destroy our youth.
Our youth and our relationships. Yeah. I mean, and to pretend that, the youth is the most troubling because they don't have a childhood of outdoor play to lean on, whereas adults who were introduced to social media 10, 15 years ago, we at least have the muscle memory of real engagement. Yeah. But there's a whole generation now that doesn't. We don't know how to work through difficulties and conflict, and it's hurting our spirits, it's hurting our bodies, it's threatening our democracy. Right. So I was sitting in my kind of pastoral role as a pulpit rabbi, trying to figure out how can I help people with this. And I turned, as one does when you're, in my position, to ancient wisdom to try to understand, what can we source from the tradition about this? You said we'd start at Genesis, so I'm just going to say one little piece from Genesis.
I wasn't kidding. Yeah.
Actually, in the book of Genesis, at the end of each day of creation, God sits back and reflects and says, "Oh, it's pretty good. It's pretty good." At the end of the 6th day, after human beings are created, God says it's very good. And the first thing in the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible, that is called not good, is Adam's aloneness, his loneliness. Lo tov heyot adam levado. It's not good for a person to be alone. And so God creates Eve, who's supposed to be his counterpart, his ezer kenegdo, the person who will be able to help him by sitting opposite him. So the rabbis tell this incredible story in the Midrash, this ancient rabbinic literature, in which they say that at the end of the 6th day of creation, the Adam and Eve had spent the whole day like frolicking in the garden and naming the animals and getting to know each other in all kinds of ways. And at the end of the day, the sun starts to set, and they've never seen sunset before. They've never seen darkness before. And as it gets darker and darker, Adam starts to freak out the way that we do when we encounter darkness for the first time in our lives. And he starts to catastrophize, and he blames himself. He says, "What did I do to deserve this?" And he goes to the extreme. He says, "It's never going to get better. This darkness will be here forever." I know that these are feelings that we can resonate to on a spiritual level. Like when things start to get really hard and we start to ask, like, why is this happening to me? And I don't think I'll ever be out of this darkness. And he's sobbing and screaming in the night. And then Eve, who was created to be his partner, just comes and sits right across from him and holds him and cries with him through the night. That's the Midrash. That's the whole story. And I feel reading that the question that it's asking us is maybe the most important question that we can ask in our lives is, who's going to cry with us through the dark of night? Because the darkness is inevitable. There will always be times of heartache and hardship and pain. We've all experienced loss of different kinds. And so who will we let in to hold us until the morning comes, like Eve holds Adam that night?
So why has it gotten worse? And the answer might be social media and the mediation of screens, but I'm curious to know your global understanding of why things have gotten, I mean, because you're seeing it. You have a control group. You have several thousand members of a religious congregation you could observe closely. So I'm very curious to know what you think is happening on the deepest level.
I think it started, I don't want to attribute all of it to social media, but certainly when we substituted Facebook friends for real friends, I think that was the beginning of the end. I mean, I remember sitting with a friend who developed early on a big social media presence, and we went out for coffee just to catch up, and he spent the whole time looking at his phone. And it was, I mean, this was early on, maybe like 2015 or something, and I just thought, I'm right here. I'm literally right here. Why are you looking to see if some stranger thinks you're clever or funny or interesting? Like, we can actually talk about things that matter together, but he didn't want that, and he felt like he didn't need that. But the thing is,
but he was getting more dopamine from his device than from you.
Than from me. Now, it could have been me. I mean,
I'm not. I wasn't implying that, but I was.
I may not be that good of a friend, but I thought it was pretty good, like at listening. So I think part of the answer is that the social media has had something to do with it for sure. All of these trends fuel each other, of course, because back to the Hannah Arendt idea, I mean, what she says that what happens is that when we're in these environments where there's extreme social alienation, they give rise to conspiracy theories. They give rise, think about that. Like if it rains on your wedding day, and someone tells you that the Jews control the weather, you might be like, oh my God, the Jews made it rain on my wedding day. But if you have any Jewish friends, you know it rained on all of our wedding days too. And then you're like, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't check out. So only when we're separated from each other, we don't know each other, we think the worst of each other, and it creates more, the distance creates more distance, which fuels these really extreme movements, which we're now seeing really across the world. So I think part of what happened over the last 20 years is we've forgotten how to look at each other as human beings. We've forgotten that this is actually what matters the most, is the relationships that we can have with each other, opening our hearts and empathy toward one another, showing up for each other in moments of joy and in moments of pain, standing with each other in solidarity, like building depth of relationship.
Talk about what your grandmother said about funerals.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great moment in the book.
My grandma, Millie, said, she said, you just go to the simcha. I don't know if other people had these rules in your home. You go to the simcha. You go to the joyous occasion, no matter what. Like, if you can afford it and you can possibly get there, you get on the plane or get in the car and go to your friend's wedding, because you have to show up in moments of joy. And, you know, as I say in the book, I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, so we kind of catastrophize as a spiritual practice. And what that means is, like, my grandma would say, you know, obviously, if there was, God forbid, a tragedy and you would have shown up for the funeral, you better get there for the bat mitzvah. Right? So I spent my whole life thinking like, oh my gosh, my friend had a baby. Do I have to go? I'm so busy. I have deadlines. And I'm like, Grandma Millie says you show up. And so I have this series of spiritual practices at the end of the book. And the first one is go to the funeral. You go to the funeral, you go to the wedding, if you can at all, because these moments actually matter. And I think probably you and I and everyone in this room can think about a moment in our lives when we were in great pain, and we know exactly who showed up for us in those moments, and we know who didn't, right? We know the friend who did not call when our loved one died. And we know the person who didn't show up at the wedding and didn't send a gift after either. And so I think what that signals to us is our brain and our heart are sort of taking in these data points, And it actually does matter when we show up for each other. I explained that I think my grandma and her generation took for granted that we would show up at the funeral. I don't think in our time you can take that for granted. I share a little story in the book in chapter 1 about my rabbi, who was this great celebrity rabbi in New York, Marcelo Bronstein. Some of you might know him. Just a beautiful and wondrous person. And Marcelo's mother died. We had already moved out to Los Angeles. And honestly, I thought, oh my God, this poor guy, thousands of people are going to be at this funeral. He's not going to have a break. Like, the last thing he needs is another person. I'm not flying in. And I didn't even call because I thought, like, he doesn't have time to answer my phone call. And I saw him, I wrote him a letter, which I still think is a really nice thing to do, a handwritten letter. I saw him a couple months later, and he said to me, Sharon, he's Argentinian. He said, Sharon, he said, I needed you, and you failed me. He said, next time you show up. And I thought, I got all defensive, and I'm like, I have little kids, and I run a community, and I live across the country, and my carbon footprint, and all the things. And then
that's the reach. All right.
And then I thought, I could let this be the most important lesson of my life, and it does mesh with my grandma's teaching, and I'm just going to learn the lesson. Like, next time, just show up. If you can, you just show up. So I take that very seriously. And in fact, what I found as I started to incorporate these messages into my heart was that it actually was made manifest very clearly in this a very obscure ancient ritual from the temple times. Which, can I share the idea? Okay. I love this. So,
okay, don't do it then.
Please, Jeffrey. Please, can I have permission?
Why is she asking?
Okay.
Just go.
So, so there's an ancient ritual that 2,000 years ago, at the time when the temple stood in Jerusalem, the Jewish people would go up on pilgrimage days up to the temple, the holiest place in the holiest city in the world, on the holiest days. And hundreds of thousands of Jews would ascend Jerusalem, a city on a hill. They would climb the steps of the Temple Mount, the most sacred place. And they would go through one of those beautiful arched entryways that some of you have probably seen in the Old City in Jerusalem. A couple of them still stand. And they would turn to the right. And then they would circle around the perimeter of the courtyard of the Temple Mount, this sacred space. And they would walk en masse, hundreds of thousands of people all at once, walking in this direction. And then they would leave in the same place where they entered, except for somebody who had a broken heart. And that person would go up to Jerusalem and up the hill and would enter the same entryway, but would turn to the left instead. So now you have hundreds of thousands of people moving this way and singular individuals walking this way. And this is where this sacred encounter would occur, in which the people going this way, who were like kind of okay that day, in fact, probably better than okay, because they were on this incredible pilgrimage, would stop and they would look into the eyes of the brokenhearted person, and they would ask this simple question, which is in Hebrew, malach, which means, what happened to you? Tell me about your heart. Tell me about the pain that you're holding. And this person would answer saying, my father just died, and I'm so upside down. I don't even know how to put one foot in front of the other. Or they would say, I'm just so worried about my kid. I just need someone to tell me she's going to be okay. Or they would say, like, the doctor called and it's not good news, right? Whatever the pain is that they're holding. And the person who's coming from this direction in the masses who stopped to talk to them would give them a blessing. And they would say something like, may the one who dwells in this place hold you with love as you navigate this difficult period. I realized that the power of this ancient ritual is that neither of these parties wants to be in this encounter, because the person who's not okay, who's bereaved and broken and bereft and ill, they don't even want to get out of bed that morning, right? We've all been in this place before. And the last thing they want to do is get out of bed and go to a place where literally the whole world is walking in one direction and they're walking in another. There's so much vulnerability. And yet they show up vulnerable, and they trust that they're going to be held tenderly by the person who encounters them. And the person who's
stranger.
What?
The stranger.
The stranger. The stranger. And the people who are going this way, I researched a lot the Hajj, testimonies from people who went on the Hajj as I was writing the book. And these are Muslims who go to Mecca, in our time, because it's really the closest equivalent to what this ancient ritual was like. And I wanted to understand like the feeling, the experience. And people talk about like their legs giving out. They arrive in this place, you save up your whole life, you dream about going, you go, you get there, and you just burst into tears. And you're surrounded by the faithful, and they're all moving en masse together. And can you even imagine you're part of this incredible spiritual movement, and then you're like at a Grateful Dead concert, and they finally play Ripple, and you're like, I've been waiting for this for 2 decades. And then like right in the middle of it, you hear the first couple notes, and then you see someone crying coming in the other direction. You're like, I got to check out for a few minutes and go see if this person's okay. Like, it's totally counterintuitive, and yet that's what they were called to do. And then you realize that is actually the sacred work. It's not, they don't bring sacrifices. They're actually there just to see another person, a broken person, and to ask them a question and hold them with love. This is the longest answer to your question, but what I recognize is that there's this whisper from the past that's saying, you want to retreat from each other. Don't pull away. Turn toward each other and find each other's humanity again. We need each other desperately, and we have the tools to do that in our hearts.
Put this in the political context of today.
Yeah.
Again, politics is downstream from all of the things that you're talking about. I guess my first question would be, can this be fixed given the one direction that our technology is taking us in? Can this be fixed? And actually just analyze it. Is like, are our political dysfunctions a byproduct of this kind of technologically enhanced isolation?
Yes, they are.
Okay, next question.
They are. I think they are a function of that. And yes, I think it can be fixed. And I think that the way that it can be fixed, and this is going to sound deceptively simple, but I think the way that it can be fixed is actually embodying the ethos of this ancient ritual in our everyday behavior. And that means actively working against the cultural current. And so what I mean is, like, we feel powerless right now to climate change. We feel powerless to the demise of democracy, which we're witnessing before our eyes right now. We feel powerless to wars that are happening, near and far. We feel powerless, and yet we're not powerless, right? There's a myth. And by the way, there are people who profit off of our sense of powerlessness, and there are people who benefit politically off of our sense of powerlessness. But we're not powerless. So the way that we reawaken our sense of agency and our moral imagination is actually by remembering that we have the capacity to peel away from the crowd and walk over to the person who's crying, coming from the other direction, and say, tell me a little bit about your heart. And what that could look like is bringing a lasagna to your neighbor who just lost a loved one. Like, literally a simple act of love that breaks us out of this isolation that has been imposed on us by this time, and actually recognizing I have some agency. There is something that I can do right now. And so I've seen this happen 1,000 times. And I just want to say, I lost my father just before the High Holy Days this past year. So I just finished my 11 months of mourner's Kaddish, saying the mourner's prayer for my dad. And I put the galleys in his hands before he died, and he was so excited about the book. So I wrote the book before he, obviously, well before he died, and then it came out shortly after he did. And what I've witnessed over the past 11 months has completely affirmed what I think the rabbis understood when they created this ritual. There's a practice of saying this mourner's prayer every day for 11 months after losing a parent. And what it requires of us is that we stand up in a room, often of strangers, and we say, I'm not okay. My dad just died. And then those strangers respond by saying, Amen. And then they say it again, Amen, 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 5 times in one prayer. And I realized that what was happening was I was being forced out of my, like, I am both by character, by nature, and by profession, a person who walks to the right. Thank God. In my life, I have not lost an immediate family member before my father. And it's also just my nature to sort of keep my eyes up and see where the help is needed. But once my father died, I was pushed into this role of turning to the left. And I was forced to let people hold me. And what I saw was the power of being held, letting someone in when we're vulnerable. And I was one of those mourners who in the beginning was like, I'm okay. Let's see who else is in need. And then after a while just said, thank you. Like, thank you for your presence here. It matters. And I saw how it touched the people who came from this direction also. So I have a colleague that works with me at IKAR in LA. And she called me. I was actually down with Mitch Kaplan visiting Books and Books in Miami. And my colleague called me and told me this experience she had listening to my book. She was in the pottery studio, and there's a stranger sitting across from her, and they sort of quietly nodded to each other. But she's listening to the book, and she thinks, okay, I got to break out of the isolation right now. So she does this very unusual thing of taking out the AirPods and just saying, hi, I don't think we know each other. Very Sun Valley, but not very LA. And so they start to talk, and she says, do you have any kids? And he says, I had 3 kids. My two sons are 30 and 32. So, and then he gets up and walks over to get more water for his pottery. And she says, the last thing in the world I wanted to do was go ask him about the 3rd child. But she realizes she has to, because he wouldn't have said it if he wasn't sort of inviting her. So she walks over to him and she says, listen, I have to ask you, you mentioned that you had 3 children, but then you said the ages of 2 of them, did you lose a child? And he said, and his eyes tear up, and he said, yeah, my daughter died by suicide just 2 years ago. And he said, it's so painful. Nobody wants to talk about it. And she said, I'll talk to you about it. And they sat down in the pottery studio, and they talked for an hour about his daughter, and he showed her a picture of him with his daughter on a bike ride the morning of her death. And he said, I'm trying for 2 years to understand how someone who loved life this much, as she does in this picture, could have needed to die by the end of the day. And he said, but the thing is, I'm sorting it out alone. And she was like, thank you for sharing with me. And so she called me, and she said, I just want to tell you, like, I know I made a difference for him, and that feels really good. But she said, it not only helped him, it helped me, because I feel so powerless right now. And now I realize I can actually go over to a stranger and say, hey, are you okay? I noticed you on the train crying. Do you want to talk? So yes, I think that we can break out of it. It just it's not going to happen by accident. It actually requires us using the agency that we have and reaffirming our ability to break through the dynamics of our time.
Very interesting. Let me ask you about an implicit assumption that, at least I'm not going to ascribe it to you, I'll ascribe it to me. Implicit assumption about the polarization and the sort of attachment to demagogues that we see as a problem in our society today. I think if I were to, there's no secret that my magazine has editorialized against Donald Trump in various ways and what Trumpism represents. But I think if I were talking to a Trump supporter and said, oh, actually, you don't believe the things that you think you believe. You're just isolated and socially polarized. And what you need to do is be more vulnerable. They'd be like, shut up. I actually believe in the things that, And so my question is, I'm assuming, one shouldn't assume, as we know, but I'm assuming that, the liberal Jewish congregation in Los Angeles that you lead is not rife with MAGA-hatted people.
Correct.
But I'm curious what you would say to someone who supports this, what I think of as an anti-democratic movement, with a very flawed human being at the head of this movement. I'm wondering what you would say to them about your diagnosis of why they support the things they support.
Okay, so the first thing is...
And I shouldn't make that assumption that maybe you have a lot of Trump supporters in your...
not that I know of, I can tell you that.
But the truth is, I mean, this is the interesting thing, and we all know this from our own, that there's two kinds of Trump supporters, those who wear red hats and those who will deny that they vote for him even as they vote for him.
Okay, so the first thing is, I mean, I'll just say, I don't believe in counter-protest. I generally, like almost as a rule, I think that when people hold a view very strongly, the most effective way to communicate with them is not to scream at them as loudly as they're screaming at you, but instead to try to engage in conversation with them. So I think that's kind of a basic rule that I have of this time. So if we apply that to the the imaginary Trump supporter that you want to talk to, I mean, the first thing I would do is not say to them, "You're totally wrong," and let me tell you that you're suffering from loneliness and social alienation, right, and this ancient Jewish ritual is going to show you the light. I would not do that, but what I would do, well, I will say that in the last chapter of the book, I have this big reveal, and you should still buy the book because there's lots of stuff we're not talking about in it. But in the Mishnah, which is the ancient Jewish text that shares this ritual, they actually give two examples of people who turn to the left. The first is the brokenhearted. The second is the ostracized. Someone who's been ostracized from the community because their words or their deeds have caused grave harm to individuals and to the collective. The ostracized are people who we're supposed to socially distance from, the community, the good ones. You know, we don't go within 6 feet of these people. We don't invite them for dinner. They don't come to this conference, right? But on the holiest days of the year, they go up to the holiest place and they join in that ritual in the direction of the brokenhearted. And when we see them coming in this direction, we do not avert our eyes. We don't walk around them. We don't kick them in the shins. We ask them, malach, the same question. Tell me about your heart. What do you see from your vantage point? And so what I would say to a Trump supporter, and so what that basically, and then we bless them the same way we bless a brokenhearted. So what I would say to someone is, like, not just someone who's coming toward us, but someone who's coming at us. Their ideas pose an existential threat to our safety in this country, for example, our future. What I would do is not say, let me tell you that you're suffering from some kind of psychosis that was brought on by social media and the algorithm and loneliness.
Or you were broken in this moment,
exactly,
and you're reacting in the wrong way to the brokenness.
What I would do is say, tell me about your heart. And I know, let me try it again. Like, literally, I want to understand you. Tell me where the pain is here. Because I can see that you are supporting this movement that seems to actually counter your own best interests, right? It's like the writing that Arlie Hochschild did about the folks who live on Cancer Alley who hated the EPA. Every single person that lived along that river had somebody who had cancer or had died from cancer because the waterway was so polluted, but they hated the EPA because it was trying to stop the pollution, and they felt like that was going to take jobs away. And so she asked them, like, tell me, what's your story? And that helped her understand them. And I think that creates an opening in which also understanding can flow in both directions. And I have 1,000 stories to prove that point, and it doesn't always work.
Do you think that all human beings, well, that's what I was going to get at.
Okay.
Like, I mean, I'm sitting here picturing, and I say this completely sincerely, I would love to be witness to a conversation between, and I'm not saying this for laughs, a conversation between you and Donald Trump. Seriously. No, I mean, seriously, like, I want, your non-judgmental, non-confrontational approach, like, what makes you tick, like, trying to understand. Yeah. And I would love to see you, I would love to see you do that. I don't know if everybody responds in the same way to the non-confrontational approach. Like, tell me about what's actually going on in your heart, and I was like, do you agree with the idea that some people are immune to these particular approaches?
Yeah, I don't think this is going to work for everybody, but I think most of the people sitting at our dinner table...
I mean, I would love to send you to Yemen to talk to the Houthis, but I'm not sure it's going to work.
So I don't think they would like me much.
Yeah. You're very charming, though.
Thank you. So I'm sending them Judy Bloom. I think she should be our ambassador to the world. I really... Let Judy talk to them.
It's like the world's worst sitcom, Judy Bloom and the Houthis. Yeah.
Look, most of the people who were scared to go home for Thanksgiving to sit at the table with are not Donald Trump or the Houthis, right? Most of them are people who we know and love, who we now feel like we don't understand at all, who post things on Instagram that we're like, oh my God, how could you, right? So in other words, I think sometimes we knock down really meaningful ways to reconnect with people because in the extremes they won't work. And I grant you that in the extremes this isn't going to work most of the time. I mean, there's always like there's the Derek Black example, the son of the Grand Wizard of the KKK who was invited to Shabbos dinner again and again and again and again, and eventually he renounces white nationalism. Like, that does happen. But I think mostly what we're talking about is, can we talk to our old friends from college who feel like they've just gone off the deep end and they're writing and saying things that feel really hurtful to me and to my family? Can I talk to my own children? Not my children, but other people's children who, not my children yet, I should say, because you never know what happens. But can we talk to each other? There's always that person at the dinner table who you're like, I'm out. And I will say, I'm going to share one story from chapter 8 that I speak about there. And there are a bunch of stories of failure and a bunch of stories of success here. But one story that I'm particularly moved by, which I'll share with you, is a congregant of mine named Hannah. She grew up Orthodox and gay. So she says, I have a very high tolerance for intolerance. That's her thing. She said, I understand. Like, it's hard. So she lives in LA. She's part of our community. And she flew to Jerusalem to be with her family for a bat mitzvah of one of her family members. And she happened to get there a couple of days early, and it was the Jerusalem Pride Parade. The Jerusalem Pride Parade is a very big deal. I mean, some of you may have seen the Tel Aviv Pride Parade is like hundreds of thousands of people, in the street celebrating. In Jerusalem, the holy city, it's much more fraught and contentious. It's much more contentious. And so...
it's actually interesting, the one thing that Hamas and the Orthodox rabbinate agree on is that the Jerusalem Pride Parade is a bad idea.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. Anyway, she went... she was standing 10 feet away from a 16-year-old girl named Shira Banky, who was stabbed in the back at the Pride Parade and murdered by an ultra-Orthodox extremist who that morning had been released from prison because 10 years earlier he had tried to murder someone at the Jerusalem Pride Parade. He was released from prison, went to the Pride Parade and killed this child who was there as an ally for her LGBTQ family and friends. My congregants were right there. They were just a couple feet away from the murder. And so they went to Friday night dinner the next night and like hands shaking, completely traumatized. Seated across the table from them at this Shabbat dinner is this young guy who my congregant had grown up with, who has become a religious extremist. And he is bragging about his rap sheet, about all kinds of acts of violence against Palestinians, against left-wing Jews, against queer people. And my congregant is really, really upset. And she has that feeling we've all had where she's like, I can't sit here anymore. And like in good conscience, I have to leave. So she wants to get up, except she's really curious about him because she starts to wonder, like, what happened to this guy? He was a sweet kid. I knew him growing up. Like, what went wrong in his brain that turned him into an extremist? And so she's just sitting across from him. She says, I'm trying to bore a hole through his head with my questions. She doesn't engage him at all. At some point, she clinks her glass and she gives a toast to the bat mitzvah kid. And she says, you're living in a country right now that is rife with extremism. Use your voice. Use our Torah, our tradition that calls us to love and not to hate, that calls us to justice and not injustice, that calls us to care about the dignity of every person. Remember that that is your calling. And then she sits down. Anyway, weekend's over, couple days pass, and this guy, the extremist, calls the family. He's upside down. He says, I realized I spent Shabbat with a lesbian. And he thought to himself, would I have wanted harm to come to her? And he said, absolutely not. She seemed like a really decent person. But now his whole worldview is shaken, and he doesn't know where he stands, and his friends are mocking him for being a liberal now. And so he's upside down. 2 years later, this guy is at the Pride Parade in Jerusalem holding a pride flag. Okay? And so literally, my congregant says, what did I achieve? I stayed at the table. I did not get up and leave, even when every bone in my body told me to get up. I stayed at the table. I write this. She gives me permission to tell the story. It's in the manuscript. Manuscript closes. Last year, Pride Parade in Jerusalem, she calls me up and she's like, open the paper. This guy is on the cover. He's wearing a rainbow kippah. He's got a trans flag. He has a baby on his shoulders holding a flag and a baby in a stroller. He's like the face of the movement now, and he changed. I mean, like, he's holding a flag that says love wins. I mean, so it doesn't work for everyone. Please don't put me in a room with Donald Trump. But it works with some people. And I think it's actually our job not to get overwhelmed with what we can't do and who we can't change, but instead to turn to each other with compassion and curiosity, because a lot of things can actually change when we lead with love.
Now I still want you in a room with Donald Trump. No, I really do, because I mean, look, in a period of national fracturing,
yeah.
I mean, you made the point. Stay at the table. Like, don't ever give up on your fellow citizen, no matter how much you're vibrating, to flee. I mean, I think that's the point. So sorry, you're having dinner with Donald Trump. We're going to have questions before that dinner commences. We're going to have questions from the audience. I think if you want to, because I'm sure there's a lot of people want to broach.
Hold on. Yeah, there we go. All right. I was told not to stand behind the plant. So mics are going around. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Please raise your hand high and be patient. We'll start right here with Barb. Thank you.
Hi, you two. Thank you so much. Can you hear this? I don't know, Sharon, if you know the work of Francis Weller, but he talks about how we're in the long dark, so it's not just going to be one night. And he talks about how there are a lot of adults in the world, but not a lot of elders. And he's trying to train us to be elders so we can sit with these kinds of conflicts. Do you have anything to say about how long this long dark is probably going to be? Do you have any sense of it?
It ends next Thursday.
There's a second midrash that mimics the first one that I shared about that first dark night for Adam and Eve, when she stayed with him and held him all night until the dawn arose in the morning. And in the second one, it's not about the length of the night, but it's about the seasons. And it's dark one night after the next, after the next, after the next. The days keep getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and the nights are longer and longer. And then at some point they do turn, and the days start to get longer again, right? When we move from winter into spring. And so I do think about that. I think that hope is fluid. We're moon people. Jews and Muslims are moon people. And so I think a lot about what it means to wax and wane, and what it means that in the darkest night, which is when you look out at the sky and it's pitch black and there's no moon visible at all, what that means is that the next night you're going to see the first sliver of a new moon. And so I do think that time is kind of expansive in that way. I am not optimistic about the future, but I'm very hopeful about the future. And what I mean by that is, like, on my dark days, we just had some dark foreboding, I think, prophecies at breakfast. But on my dark days,
it's pretty heavy breakfast. Yeah.
I do worry. Yeah, I'm a lot of fun. At lunch, never at breakfast, but at lunch, I'm like, yeah. Jeff asked me, is anyone just full of joy at IKAR, or is your community all, people who are
really sad?
Really sad. No, it's great fun. It is. I'll say something about joy, actually. But Barb, to your question, I I think we have immense challenges ahead of us, and it's going to take a true force of love to push us through this darkness. And it's going to also mean that we prepare for the marathon and not the sprint. And we understand that we have a lot of work to do here. I mean, the climate crisis alone and this kind of ticking clock that we have is really enough to keep you up at night. And the only reason to sleep is because we need the energy for tomorrow. So, but the reason that I say I'm hopeful, even though I'm not optimistic, is because I think the difference between the two, I don't think things are going to turn out okay, but I think we have to make things turn out okay. I think we have to actually be active in bringing about this kind of hopeful, promising future. I just came back from 3 weeks in Israel, and the first night that I landed, we didn't talk about Israel at all so far today, Jeff. Yeah.
I guess we are now, though.
I'll just say there's so much devastation, there's so much heartache and human suffering in Israel and Palestine, and it's so heartbreaking. And the first night that I arrived, I got off the plane and went to an arena in Tel Aviv that was packed with Israelis and Palestinians who were arguing that we need to fight through the despair and actually create a landscape for peace. And every person who spoke, there was total parity on the stage. Every Israeli Jew who spoke was followed by a Palestinian, was followed by an Israeli, was followed by a Palestinian. The place was packed. Like, all the peace organizations work together, which is in itself a miracle. I mean, if you think about how fractured our left is, for example. And basically what they said is, out of this nightmare, we have to stake a claim in a new dream. And so I feel like this dark night is quite long. And it will be. It's not going to be over on next Thursday. But we have the tools actually to transform our society. And I think it starts with expanding the scope of moral concern, expanding our moral imagination, expanding our loving hearts, and actually reclaiming our humanity in the process. And so that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort, but I feel we have no other choice. I mean, otherwise we just give up. We give up to this future of fascism and climate collapse. And there's no way. I'm not leaving my children that inheritance.
Thanks. All the way up at the top of the aisle.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Sharon. So much of what you have to say resonates with me. I'm a Reform Jew who teaches at a Catholic university. So my question has to do with interfaith dialogue and higher education. I know those are kind of two questions, so you can take one or the other, but so much of what you say makes me hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you. Interfaith dialogue. Look, I think I was just saying to Jeffrey earlier, I mean, I wrote this book really rooted in Jewish wisdom, but I didn't write it for Jews only. I hope Jews read the book, but I wrote it really for a broad audience. And the idea is that it's really rooted in principles that I think should speak to all people of faith and people of no faith at all, which is, we actually need to turn to one another with compassion and with curiosity, precisely at the moment that we most want to retreat from one another. And especially in the last 10 months, I think interfaith dialogue has been extremely challenging. We're coming to the table with really different narratives. And I think, again, if we focus on not telling each other why they've got it wrong, and why we're right instead, but instead asking, tell me about your story. Tell me about your narrative and tell me about your heart. I think we can actually find our way to each other. How does this connect to the universities? I mean, it's pretty heartbreaking what's going on in the universities. I keep saying to myself, if somebody had told me a year ago that something would happen that would make me question my faith in the institutions of higher education, I wouldn't really believe it. I mean, I heard the warnings and I just didn't really... I didn't really align with them. I took them seriously, but I didn't ever think that I would wonder, like, is my kid going to be safe on campus? That's not a question I ever ask myself before this past year. It's really dangerous and really difficult. And here, the same principles apply. I think we have to look toward intimacy and relationships. So massive groups of people trying to hash it out on the college lawn is not the way that we're going to find our way to each other. But two people sitting together in a cafe before, during, or after the protests could be a way that we start to find our way to each other. I know that the president of Barnard, for example, took on actually bringing small groups of people, only 4 students at a time, into lunch meetings with her every single day for the second semester, and just saying, let's talk to each other, let's learn each other's stories, because it's very hard to demonize a person when you actually see them as a person. It's much easier to demonize them when you see them as the embodiment of an idea that you find to be toxic. And so how can we actually find our way into that process of rehumanization? And I believe that when we do, we're not only rehumanizing the other, we're actually rehumanizing ourselves in the process.
Thank you. Right up here? No, no question. There's a question right down here. Thank you.
Thank you. I had to write it down. I hope you don't mind if I read off my phone, because otherwise I'll ramble. I really want to say I appreciate your anecdote at the beginning of those who walk right and then those who walk left individually. And I appreciate what you just said, but why I shot my arm up is I think that we are uncomfortably living in a time where I kind of want to challenge the last thing that you might have just said, where when we see each other as people, when we see each other as human beings and we can connect, that's where we can have conversation. I myself am a Jew. I'm Ashkenazi Jew. I'm also Armenian, so both sides of my family really got it bad. But I'm married to a Palestinian. And so we have family on, obviously, both sides of that conflict, and we both feel very passionately, and there's a lot of love in our family, thankfully, for one another. But I have friends in the community who, when the conflict became bad, vocalized extreme opinions on anyone who didn't stand with them. And my husband is very passionate about communication. I hope you don't mind I share an anecdote. There is a question here. But someone I've known since I was 5 years old from my community said to him, just because you're married to a Jew, it doesn't make you not a terrorist or an anti-Semite. Only because he said, maybe don't call every Palestinian a terrorist. So my question for you, with that context there, is in a time where we see those walking left, we don't look at someone with one issue and say, I want to connect with you. We've done the opposite, and I think that there is a political timeline here where this shift happened. But instead, we see someone, and based off of one single observation, we decide to alienate that person, not to connect with them. We've flipped the stack here a bit, and I want to ask you, how do we communicate when instead of being willing to have conversation with someone when you don't agree or you have a different level of views, how can you encourage somebody to have conversation with you? How can you communicate when, if I say I believe one thing and you say you believe another, not you, but someone else might say, I'm not willing to talk to you then. Right. I understand sitting at the table, but I think that there are more people who are more interested in just yelling across the table and telling you you're wrong. Yeah. So how do we reignite conversation? How do we go back to seeing someone and saying, by one thing, let's connect instead of disconnect?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I hope we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more afterwards, because we don't have a lot of time to answer this, but I'll do my best to say. I think that in our time of extreme polarization, that we fear consciously or subconsciously, that if I take in someone else's narrative, that means that I am subverting or undermining my own narrative. That if I actually hear someone else's story, I'm diminishing my own. And I actually think that our hearts are capacious enough to hold both. And so I believe that I, as a Jew, have a particular obligation to hold the sorrow of my Jewish family. I think that that obligation comes straight from the book of Leviticus, and it also is very natural and tribal and biological. When it says love your fellow as yourself, v'ahavta l'orecha kamocha, what that means, and the way it's been translated for thousands of years by Jewish commentators, is you have to love your Jewish family. But that doesn't mean that that's the only obligation we have. It also says in the Torah numerous times, "V'ahavtem et hager," you have to love the stranger. And the stranger is identified as anyone who's suffering the most in the world, because you know the heart of the stranger. And so what that means, the way I translate that now, is that I have two obligations to love right now. One is to love and care for my own family, who's suffering immensely. And the other is to love and care for the Palestinians, who are suffering immensely. And one does not undermine the other. And so I literally sat in a living room a couple of weeks ago in a friend's house and heard from a Palestinian friend of mine who lives in Los Angeles, whose family is from Khan Yunis. She's an OBGYN in LA. And she described that she created an Excel spreadsheet to keep track of all of her family members who've died since October 7th in the retaliation for the Hamas attacks. She had to keep an Excel spreadsheet. The number reached 161. This is a horrifying and unfathomable amount of loss. And I also just sat last week in Jerusalem with the family of Hersh Goldberg Polin. And we sat in the center of Jerusalem and we sang for hours and hours for the release of the captives, who I literally think about every time I sit down for a meal and I'm about to put food in my mouth and I think, are they eating today? And so I know that it's not impossible to hold both of those truths, because I'm holding it in my little body. I'm holding it, and you're holding it in your family. And so I believe that there's a myth that if I, as a Jew, were to open my heart to see a Palestinian as a human being and not as a terrorist, then I'm giving up my Jewish inheritance, right? My Jewish victim status. And I think that the same is felt on the other side. And that's why these maximalist extremist visions are actually dominating the college walk and dominating the public sphere. There's this sense that you're right, you're wrong, and I'm right. And I'm fully right and you are fully wrong, that totally dehumanizes all of us. And I think the only way to move through this is to continue to insist that we are all human beings full of sorrow. And when we see each other in this, as we circle the world together now, to actually try to meet sorrow with sorrow. To meet your broken Palestinian heart with my broken Jewish heart, to meet your broken to find our way to one another as human beings who are all in pain. By the way, I sat with a Palestinian friend, a new friend in Jerusalem, just a couple weeks ago, born and raised in the old city of Jerusalem. And I did not know this, but he told me that do you know how many Palestinians live in the diaspora? There's 7 million. I'm so struck by this. There's 7 million Palestinians in the diaspora and about 7 million in the land. There's 7 million Jews in the diaspora and about 7.5 million Jews in the land. Like, I keep finding all of these parallels, all of these reasons why, of all the people in the world, we should understand each other. Like, nobody in the world wants the Jews. Nobody wants the Palestinians. We should be able to understand each other's humanity and each other's broken hearts. And I feel like I want to keep pulling back to that place. Like in the Torah, it says, you should love the stranger, for you know the heart of the stranger. And I feel like I continually say, my Jewish generational trauma is precisely what opens me up to feel empathic and loving toward the other that is also suffering immensely. And that does not diminish my Jewishness. It does not diminish my commitment to get every single hostage home. It does not diminish my commitment to end this war as quickly as possible and bring the parties to the table for a true long-term comprehensive peace. All of that is precisely because of my love for my people and my love for humanity.
Amen.
You're in?
Amen. Fine. Amen. Thank you very much for doing this.
We could talk about that
Look,
over
they're
lunch.
standing up for you. Can you get up? Yeah, look. Take a bow. Thank you.
Sharon, thank you so much.